Hi everyone, I'm Laura Dormer from the Evidence Space, and today I'm pleased to be joined by Tim Wright, who's Executive Vice President for Access and Pricing at Genesis Research Group. So welcome, Tim.
Oh, thanks, Laura. Pleased to be
Great to
here.
have you. Many people, I'm sure, will have seen Tim's packed out session at ISPOR Europe 2025 in Glasgow, where he provided us with a timely analysis of the evolving most favoured nation policy and the implications of that for pricing and market access strategy. But of course, as we all know, MFN continues to move quickly. And with new policy signals emerging since that session, we're really pleased to have Tim with us today to discuss some of those latest developments and what they might mean for manufacturers. But Tim, before we get into the updates, could you start by giving us a bit of a brief overview of your ISPOR session and some of the key themes that you focused on there?
Oh yeah, no, Laura, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you everybody who turned up to listen to the topic. It was a packed room. We had about 250 or 300 people who couldn't get in as well. So I mean, clearly, it is a really interesting topic. And what I covered then and what I want to go through today really is some of the key components. So I think one of the key areas that I covered in the Glasgow session of ISPOR and what I run through in the next sort of 10 minutes or so really is around the way that we've pulled together our perspective, and we've used three sources of insight. So the first one, which is what most other analyses have done, are focused on those policy documents, and it's not only the policy documents that have come out from CMS, it's also documents that have come out on legal judgment and from the Supreme Court as well. And those documents give you the raw information. And actually our perspective is that you need to put that into the context. And the way that we've developed that context is, first of all, through informal discussions with key people in our networks. We've got a lot of people who are working within CMS. We've had discussions with them to try and get their perspectives. I think that's important. And then also our clients, because our clients are the people who are clearly reacting to MFN. And those are the ones for whom MFN is going to have the biggest impact. And I think the third component as well, which is often overlooked, is really the way in which President Trump has really played through any negotiation strategy. And it's not only around drug pricing, it's also around tariffs and even looking at broader geopolitical questions as well. And that's really through the art of the deal. So let's look at that first of all. And President Trump's approach to negotiation it follows a common theme, and he himself has sort of set this out in the art of the deal, which is basically you ask for something very big, knowing fully well that you'll probably end up with something which is a lot lower, and actually you probably end up with something that's lower that you're happy with. So in the case of MFN, what we saw within the executive order was lower prices for all Americans, set at the lowest European price. Our perspective is that actually the acceptable outcome may well be some lower prices, also including some increase in US inward investment, and then also some component of direct consumer. So I think that's one part of the context, which is the approach that President Trump and the administration have taken to negotiation. The other part of the context really is to look at what's happened in the past. So we know that in 2020, there was an original executive order, which was far broader. And really that failed on a legal challenge. It failed a legal challenge in the Supreme Court, and a number of states has also upheld the fact that the executive order couldn't be approached for all products through all channels. And we think that the second Trump administration has learned from that experience. The other part, which I think is quite important and can be confusing for some people, is that the Inflation Reduction Act in 2022, there was a component in there which is around maximum fair prices for CMS. And essentially that was a pricing model where CMS negotiated with manufacturers of drugs who had the highest budget impact for CMS Part D. And those budget impacts for the individual drugs range from around about $2 billion to $18 billion. So they're massive spends for CMS. We saw earlier on this year that those prices, the maximum negotiated fair price, were published for implementation in January of 2026. And that's the first 10. The next 15 are going to be for 2027, are going to be released later on, probably within January. CMS have said that they're looking to try and get those through by the end of this year, but it may go into January. The executive order, the 2025 executive order, does not touch that sort of the ongoing work within under the Inflation Reduction Act. What the 2025 executive order focuses on is three components. So there's one component which is direct to consumer at MFN prices. And the idea of that was to, using the words within the executive order, to cut out the middleman, which is really the pharmacy benefit managers, the PBMs, because the PBM model relies on rebates being paid by manufacturers for their revenue, and then they pass on some of those rebates to the patients. So in order to get those rebates directly to the patients, the idea is to try and get an additional direct-to-consumer platform that cuts out the PBM. The second part of that was really around to try and encourage direct inward investment to the US. And that's not necessarily a stated aim of the 2025 executive order, but we can see that some of the wording and the discussions that have happened around imposition of tariffs have led to direct inward investment. And the third part, which I'm going to concentrate on today, and which I concentrated on ISPOR, is really around that international price convergence, which is the most favored nation pricing. And the wording within the executive order was that CMS was being asked to propose a rulemaking plan to impose most favored nation pricing. So what I'd like to do now is just basically go on saying, okay, where do we not start the journey? It's where do we restart the journey? Because the executive order in 2020, as I say, provided some of the context. So what I'll do is very quickly go through the first two components, which is looking at DTC and MFN price, encouraging US inward investment to see what changes have already happened. And then I'll focus mainly on the rest of the world price conversions, the MFN part. So if we look at what the current status is around those first two, so the direct consumer and then also the US investment, these were, both of those components were very, very well publicized. Importantly, they had only selective applications. So there's only a few manufacturers who have had discussions with the administration about setting up a direct to consumer platform. Pharma, the US drug industry trade body, has also said that it's going to set up a direct consumer platform. And then obviously a lot of people would have heard of Trump RX as well, which is another one. So we're waiting to see what the detail of those is in January. But our perspective on this is that they will be limited. There will be selective drugs. It won't be direct consumer prices at MFN prices for all of the manufacturers' portfolios. It'll be selected. And in terms of inward investment, we've seen again a number of major manufacturers who have quite publicly stated that they are going to make inward investment, again in line with Make America Great Again policy from the administration around R&D facilities within the US. And I think that's important because having these public concessions and negotiating those public deals is really important in showing that the administration has been successful in trying to tackle some of these issues around drug pricing. Now, the MFN component is the third component. So I'm going to concentrate on that. There are three components for the 2025 executive order. Now, actually, Generous, which is the first one that came out in November, was a little bit of a surprise for most people. We've seen that Globe and Guard were publicized. So Globe is looking at Medicare Part B, and Guard is looking at Medicare Part D. Now, Generous was looking at Medicaid, and the important component of all of these is that it needs to go through the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Innovation. And the reason why that's important is because the failure, the legal failure for the 2020 executive order was because it was too broad. The CMMI really sets up ways of testing different pricing models. So that already gives an indication that these are going to be, again, very selective, rather than applying to all drugs for all companies. So let me just go very quickly onto an overview of Generous, because that's the one that we've got the most information. It's around Medicaid, as I said. And I would encourage anyone to have a look at this very short video by Abe Sutton, who's the director of CMMI, and listen very carefully to the language. So the language he's using is about voluntary participation. There's no sort of strong language about enforcement in there. And he's very clear that he's talking about different pricing models. So that was published in November. So let me just give you a very quick overview of what that generous model looks like. I know it's for Medicaid, but it could give us an indication of what we may see in GUARD and GLOBE. So it's a voluntary model that spans for a maximum of 5 years. Manufacturers can opt in. They can also opt out after a year. And that's perfectly in line with it being a testing model for different prices rather than it being actually compulsory. The voluntary is not only on the manufacturer's side, it's also voluntary from the state participation side as well. So states also have to say they want to be part of generous. Now, the key thing really that was included within generous that may give us an indication about GUARD and GLOBE is really around the methodology. And the generous methodology is saying that participating manufacturers need to volunteer their net prices for the covered outpatient drugs. And the key thing here is really around all prices after all rebates, discounts, and other price concessions have been made. And it focuses on price. So there have been a number of discussions that we've had with our clients around, okay, well, how does that take into account? What do we do with outcomes-based agreements? Because they are not necessarily price agreements. And our perspective is that we're looking at the net prices. So if the guidance that we're giving our clients currently is that actually, if you do want to participate in there, you can select which prices that you want to divulge and have used within the MFN. The markets that are included in there are UK, France, Germany, Italy, Canada, Japan, Denmark, and Switzerland. And the methodology says it's choosing the second lowest by GDP using a purchasing power parity methodology to adjust for the differences in GDP. Now, what's important is the fact that it's chosen the second lowest, and our discussions within CMS is because that allows the exclusion of any outliers. What is really sort of interesting and important that we have seen, so in mid-November, so only a couple of weeks ago, there was an inclusion within the French finance bill, which almost excludes manufacturers from sharing net prices that have been offered through to France. So the aim of the MFN from the US perspective is that pharmaceutical companies will volunteer their net prices. We've already seen reactions from one country, France, about disclosure of net prices. And it's key because we see that within the UK as well. So a lot of prices are confidential prices. And I think what we've been saying to manufacturers is you need to think very, very carefully about what your legal obligations are to those individual markets rather than going straight in and showing those. So it's not as simple and straightforward as it may appear. And then in return for all of that, any participating manufacturer, the return is that that there is common coverage criteria across all of the states that participate. And that can be important because it is quite an administrative burden to go and negotiate coverage criteria state by state. Again, if you listen to Abe Sutton, the little video that he put on there, actually there's an indication that it's not sort of particularly advantageous coverage criteria. It's going to be best based on what is currently being offered to the states anyway. So as a concession to us, it doesn't seem particularly great. Well, one of the other areas of discussion really is around the pricing. And I've highlighted a little bit around generous, around the net pricing. If we look at GUARD and GLOBE, there are opportunities within those because they're pricing models to use different prices. So within the US, we know that there is a spectrum of prices from WAC down to the Big Four. All of those are published. And then when we're thinking about the most favored nation, so for the markets that are included within that basket, they could either use the list or they could use a confidential net. I've mentioned already about the confidential net, but there is a possibility that within GLOBE and GUARD, the comparison will be made at a list price. And why is that important? Well, that is important because we've done a quick analysis of all of the drugs that have been launched since 2024 and have a price in the US and in Europe. And you can understand this aligns with what the administration had been saying. And President Trump, within his statements around MFN and the executive order, has said that the American people are paying 3 times the price of drugs within other European markets. And that may be true at launch, but even though prices do rise within the US through rebates, once you start getting competition in there, the way that manufacturers are securing preferred status within the formulary is through rebates and discounts. So actually that differential will get smaller. So there is definitely a case for manufacturers thinking about what sort of prices could be included in Garden Globe, because some of the prices that we see within Europe may actually be not that different from what we're seeing within the US if they're looking at non-launch products. Another approach that we've seen, so again, looking at the context, is we wanted to see what other pricing comparisons have taken place within the US system. And the HHS, so the Department for Health and Human Services, have done a number of analyses. They've done at least one with update recently, comparing prices. Again, the outcome wasn't that different, but they used the IQVIA MIDAS dataset. And the IQVIA MIDAS dataset is a derived pricing dataset. If you talk to anybody within IQVIA, they will say that actually they do not reflect the net prices. However, the advantage of using that MIDAS dataset is that those prices are publicly available if you buy them. They are comprehensive, so they are global. And that enables, if they were going to be used within Garden Globe, it enables CMS to be able to say, actually, these are public prices. So what we're considering as well is that actually the IQVIA MIDAS dataset may be included in Garden Globe. And this is why we're keeping a watchful eye on all of this, because I said right at the beginning, this is the gift that keeps on giving, and things keep changing, week on week, and we're expecting more change when Garden Globe come in, hopefully, well, we think it'll be around about January. So what have we been doing for our clients, and what are we saying for our clients is, I think it's really important to review all of the detail and not just look at the policy documents. It's important to see what publicly is being said from the White House. It's really important for us to keep a watchful eye on Generous. Generous remains open until the middle of next year, so we should be able to get an indication about who is taking part, which states are taking part, and then hopefully what manufacturers are taking part. We're recommending as well, because we don't know what the prices are that are going to be used for the determination of the MFN, is really to look at all of the different price data sources available and then do the analysis on each of those. And I think by doing that, you'll understand what the exposure risk is to your portfolio. And then the final thing, as we've seen from the challenges that I mentioned from the finance bill in France, and then also just thinking about NICE within the UK, there is no compulsion. There can be no legal compulsion for manufacturers to divulge net prices. So a lot of the concern has been about divulging European net pricing will have an impact, a massive impact on not only the US prices, but it could also have an impact on international reference pricing where that country has been included within a basket. So what's next? Well, we're expecting in early 2026 Globe and Guard to be published, so we'll have an indication then about what methodology is being used. As I said, we're expecting there to be some GDP taken into consideration through purchasing power parity. We don't know what prices there are. There could be a number of different prices in the comparisons for Globe and Part B and Guard Part D. I think it's really important not only just to focus on the US policy, even though it is an executive order from the US and it's focused on reducing US prices, they are going to be implicated by what happens ex-US. So we're definitely keeping an eye on what's happening in the European countries as well around what's happening with their policies and their laws. We'll get an indication about the pharma direct to consumer, Trump RX, and then also the manufacturers in January. That's when they are publicizing what that framework is going to be. Our expectation is going to be a platform with selected access to MFN-like prices. And then, as I said, the next round, the next 15 drugs to be included within the maximum fair prices under the Inflation Reduction Act are going to be released either at the end of December or January. And I think that's really important as well to understand, because if that's our perspective, again, is if those drugs are included within the MFP, then it's unlikely that they're going to also be included within any MFN. So that was a sort of overview from Glasgow, and actually, Laura, a bit more, because honestly, this is so fast in its evolution.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, thank you for that. It's really, really interesting to hear what you presented at Glasgow, but also the new developments since. I mean, as you say, I think this is something that's changing, week to week. So it's important for us to keep up with what's going on. I mean, one of the things you mentioned was the release of the generous methodology, and I think that came out sort of mid-November, didn't it, after your presentation? You've spoken about this a little bit, but what aspects of that methodology sort of really stood out to you as the most relevant for what we might anticipate coming next year?
So it was interesting. We saw that the adjustment for GDP was included within 2020 executive order. There was no hint that would be included within any of the 2025 executive order. So I think the fact that there's a purchasing power parity adjustment it is important, because it does diminish the difference in the prices from the ex-US countries and the US prices. That's important, and I think that is an important concession that our clients and manufacturers is actually can be beneficial to them. And the second one is the inclusion of the net price, because that will be really quite challenging from an ex-US legal perspective for the disclosure. So I think manufacturers, are rightly concerned, and any impact on US prices, negative impact on US prices, is clearly going to have a big impact on revenues. But there is, to us, we think there is a flaw in the current MFN methodology in generous. There's just expecting manufacturers to break the confidentiality that they have with the ex-US countries. And I think that's going to be really interesting to see how manufacturers respond to that and how the administration responds. But they may change things in Globe and Guard when they realize that is actually a problem.
And build on that. So obviously a big discussion at all the conferences has been MFN. The other for us this year has been the discussions around the Inflation Reduction Act. And as you mentioned, there'll be developments on that hopefully either end of December, early January. But the IRA and MFN are linked together in lots of conversations. Could you talk us a little bit about some of the differences and how they intersect?
Yeah, I mean, so there are big differences around the drugs that can be included. So the IRA, looking at the favoured prices, most favoured prices, negotiated prices under the IRA, are looking at drugs that have been in the market for a long while. And in essence, it's almost, this harks back to when NICE was being formed. So I'm that old, I can remember, and was involved as NICE was being formed as well. So I was working in industry at that point. And the focus then, the original focus, was looking at trying to imply cost effectiveness analyses on drugs that have a high budget impact for the NHS. And that's really what the IRA approach is doing, is focusing on those drugs that have got the highest budget impact. As I mentioned, it's been between 2 and 18 billion for the first 10 drugs. Within the MFN, it's likely to be different. We think it's more likely to be, well, it's voluntary to start off with, but it's likely to be for the newer launched drugs. We also think that there is an exclusion around orphan drugs. There's been a discussion about whether orphan drugs should be excluded even under the IRA. So there's some similarities in there. Again, it's difficult, other than looking through the detail of the policy, it's difficult to see or to make a definitive comment until we've seen what's actually within Globe and Guard. But they appear to have the similar sort of intent, which is to try and reduce the cost to CMS. The other point is that through the DTC within the 2025 executive order, that's not necessarily for those drugs that are covered by CMS. I mean, that's patients being able to go in there so they could be self-insured, for example. So the scope is different. The intent is the same. I think the other point to raise as well is that they've got the Inflation Reduction Act was not anything to do with Donald Trump, and the executive order around MFN is his approach to trying to reduce prices. So I think just that sort of small context can have implications.
Absolutely. So coming to the end of our time now, but looking ahead, you've given us some sort of key milestones to watch out for over the next few months. What sort of practical steps would you advise for us to prepare for these potential MFN related activities, and how do you see this kind of playing out?
Yeah, no. I mean, really, really good question, Laura. Thank you. I think it's in those 3 points that I raised at the end of the presentation. Really, is just to keep a watchful eye on what is coming out of the White House, what's coming out of CMMI, because we know that Global Guard would be coming through. I would definitely pore over the details of the methodology within those, and then compare across the three. And also just to take a step back and just think realistically, how can this be applied? Because we saw within Generous that it was voluntary participation. By the fact that they are pricing models, it'd be interesting to see what comes out of Global Guard. I think the other thing to do is also just to, if you're working within a pharmaceutical company in a global role, is to make sure that you're keeping in contact with your colleagues within the individual countries, because they will be keeping an eye on what the policies and the laws within their countries are, sort of how they're evolving. Where I mentioned a couple of times now about the finance bill within France. I mean, that was clearly around MFN, and I think there'll be some statements coming through around that part. I think Trump RX will be really important to understand, how that works. It'll also be really important to have a look at what the other direct-to-consumer platforms are, because again, our perspective is going to be quite selective. So that will be an indication. And then, as I said, just keep an eye on what the next tranche of the maximum fair prices, negotiated prices are. Again, will give an indication, because when I started the presentation off by saying context is really important, it is really important to take all of the information into account. And it's also important to think about the way that the administration is negotiating and its negotiating style, rather than just looking at all of the detail included in relatively dry policy documents.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tim, so much for this update. It's going to be really interesting to see how this evolves over the coming weeks and months. And I'm pleased to share with everybody as well that we're going to be having some more videos in this series coming up in 2026 to hopefully help us keep up with all these developments. So thank you again, Tim, for speaking with us today.
Oh, Laura, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.